Florida, 1979. A courtroom packed with journalists, lawyers, and cameras, and at the center of it all, a man who represented himself flirted with the judge and told the court he would never confess, except he already had. In private sessions with detectives, Ted Bundy spent hours discussing his crimes in careful clinical language, always in the third person. Never, "I did this." Always the person responsible for these acts. Psychologists who studied those recordings said the same thing. They had never seen anyone so completely dissociate from his own actions while simultaneously controlling every detail of how they were perceived. Most people who covered this case asked, "What did he do?" The behavioral vault is going to ask a different question. What happened to him first?
November 24th, 1946. Burlington, Vermont. Theodore Robert Cowell is born at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers, a facility that existed specifically for women who could not publicly acknowledge their pregnancies. His mother, Louise Cowell, was 22 years old and unmarried. His biological father's identity was never officially confirmed. Some records suggest a man named Lloyd Marshall. Others point to Louise's own father, Samuel Cowell. A claim that was never proven, but was never fully dismissed either. From the moment of his birth, Ted Bundy's identity was built on a lie. He was taken home not as Louise's son, but as her brother. His grandparents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell, registered him as their own child. The woman he called mother for the first decade of his life was actually his grandmother. The young woman he believed was his sister was the person who had given birth to him. Now, here is where psychology becomes essential. Attachment theory, developed by British psychiatrist John Bowlby, tells us that the bond between a child and their primary caregiver in the first years of life is not just emotional, it is neurological. It shapes how the brain processes relationships, trust, identity, and emotional regulation for the rest of that person's life. When that bond is based on a fundamental deception, when the very architecture of who you are is a carefully constructed fiction, the psychological consequences can be severe. But there was something else happening in that house. Samuel Cowell, Ted's grandfather, the man he believed was his father, was, by multiple accounts, a deeply violent man. Neighbors described him as a bully. Family members reported that he beat his dogs, swung cats by their tails, and had explosive, unpredictable rages. He was also reportedly deeply racist and held rigid, dominating views about how his household would operate. This was the first male figure in Ted Bundy's life. In 1950, Louise took 4-year-old Ted and moved to Tacoma, Washington, ostensibly to start fresh. The following year, she married a man named Johnny Culpepper Bundy. It was this man's surname that Ted would carry for the rest of his life. By all accounts, Johnny was kind, decent, unremarkable. Ted never bonded with him. Those who knew Bundy as a child described a boy who was shy, socially awkward, and deeply uncomfortable around other children his age. He was intelligent, perhaps unusually so, but there was something detached about him, something that kept him at a distance from ordinary human connection. He had learned, very early, that the people closest to you could be living a lie. Sometime in his early teenage years, the exact moment is disputed. Ted Bundy discovered the truth. Some accounts say a cousin showed him his birth certificate. Others say he found it himself. But at some point, the architecture of his entire childhood collapsed in a single moment of clarity. The woman he called his sister was his mother. The man he called his father was his grandfather. His real father was unknown, and everyone around him, everyone he trusted, had known and said nothing. Dr. Dorothy Otno Lewis, a forensic psychiatrist who evaluated Bundy before his execution, described this revelation as a profound narcissistic injury, a wound to the core of his self-concept so deep that it fundamentally altered how he related to the world and to other people. But Bundy did not fall apart. At least not visibly. Instead, he became very good at pretending. By the time he arrived at the University of Washington in the mid-1960s, Ted Bundy had constructed a new version of himself, charming, articulate, politically ambitious. He volunteered for a suicide prevention hotline, where he worked alongside crime writer Anne Rule, who would later write the definitive account of his crimes. She described him as empathetic, warm, exactly the kind of person you would want answering that phone. It was during this period that he met the woman researchers have referred to as Stephanie Brooks, though her real name was never officially published. She was from a wealthy California family, sophisticated. Exactly the kind of woman he had decided he deserved. She broke up with him in 1968. The reasons were practical. She felt he lacked direction, ambition, a future. But for Bundy, the rejection triggered something far deeper than heartbreak. Forensic psychologist Al Carlisle, who evaluated Bundy in 1976 and spent more time in direct psychological examination with him than almost any other professional, wrote that Bundy experienced this rejection as a confirmation of his deepest fear. That he was, fundamentally, not enough. That the identity he had constructed was a performance that had failed the moment it was truly tested. What happened next is critical. Rather than confronting this pain directly, Bundy retreated into a parallel internal world, one that psychologists who studied his case have described as increasingly detached from reality and dominated by fantasy, violent fantasy, fantasy in which he was in complete control and the women who represented rejection had none. Dr. Robert Hare's foundational research on psychopathy identifies two core clusters of traits: the emotional interpersonal cluster, which includes lack of empathy, superficial charm, and grandiosity, and the antisocial lifestyle cluster, which includes impulsivity, poor behavioral control, and criminal behavior. Bundy exhibited both, but what made his case particularly complex was the degree to which these traits were masked, deliberately, intelligently, behind a constructed persona of warmth and normalcy. The mask was the mechanism. And it had been in place since childhood. Between 1974 and 1978, Ted Bundy committed a series of murders across at least 7 states: Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, Florida, Idaho, and California. He confessed to 30 homicides shortly before his execution in 1989. Most investigators believe the actual number was higher. What matters for our analysis is not the number, it's the pattern. Bundy specifically targeted young women who resembled his ex-girlfriend, Stephanie Brooks. Dark hair, parted in the middle. Psychologists have long noted this as a behavioral signature. The crimes were, in a deeply distorted way, a ritualized reenactment of a rejection he could never process through any other means. He approached victims in public places, often feigning injury or impersonating authority. A police officer, a fireman. He relied entirely on his constructed persona of trustworthiness. His victims helped him because he seemed like someone who deserved to be helped. This is the behavioral paradox at the center of his psychology. The same tools he had developed to survive a childhood built on deception, the ability to present a false self, to read what others needed to see and provide it, became the tools of predation. His escalation was also telling. Criminologists who studied his timeline noted that the frequency of his crimes increased significantly following periods of personal stress. Job setbacks, relationship difficulties, academic pressure. The fantasy that had once contained the aggression was no longer sufficient. The breaking point, it turned out, was not a single moment. It was a process. When Ted Bundy was finally arrested, something unusual happened. He did not collapse. He did not deny everything and shut down. Instead, he did what he had always done. He performed. In recorded interviews and documented interrogation sessions with detectives, including Robert Keppel of the Washington State Attorney General's office, Bundy displayed a series of behavioral patterns that remain some of the most studied examples of psychopathic self-presentation under pressure. First, the consistent use of the third person. Bundy rarely said, "I killed." He said, "the person who did these things," or "the individual responsible." Forensic linguists have identified this pattern as a dissociative distancing technique. The language creates psychological separation between the speaker and the acts, allowing the speaker to maintain emotional composure while discussing events they know they committed. For Bundy, this was not accidental. It was controlled. He had constructed a narrative of his own guilt that allowed him to discuss it as though it were happening to someone else. Second, strategic disclosure. Bundy released information incrementally, always giving just enough to seem cooperative, never enough to be definitive. Detectives who worked with him described the experience as negotiating with someone who was simultaneously confessing and negotiating the terms of his own legacy. He wanted to be understood as complex, interesting, worthy of study. This, too, was a form of control. Third, the moment the mask slipped. In a 1989 interview with Dr. James Dobson, conducted less than 24 hours before his execution, Bundy attributed his crimes to pornography. Researchers and forensic psychologists widely rejected this explanation as a final, calculated performance, a narrative that would generate sympathy, controversy, and continued relevance after his death. But in that same interview, for a brief moment, something else appeared. When asked about his victims directly, not his psychology, not his childhood, but the specific women he had killed, Bundy's composure fractured. His eyes changed. His speech became faster, less controlled. Body language analysts who have studied that footage note it as one of the clearest examples of what psychologists call affect regulation failure. A momentary breakdown of the emotional regulation system that had kept the mask in place. It lasted less than 3 seconds. Then he was composed again. Some people never lose control. Bundy lost it for 3 seconds in 43 years. That tells you something about the architecture underneath. So, what do we take from this? Ted Bundy was not born a monster. The evidence does not support that conclusion. What the evidence suggests is a human being who experienced profound attachment disruption in the earliest years of life, who was raised in an environment of deception and witnessed violence as a model of masculine authority, who suffered a catastrophic identity crisis at a formative age, who experienced a rejection that his fragile, constructed self-concept could not absorb, and who, crucially, never received any psychological intervention at any point along that trajectory. Dr. Ann Burgess, a nursing professor at Boston College who co-developed the FBI's criminal profiling methodology and conducted landmark research on serial killers in the 1980s, found consistently that the most dangerous trajectories were not those marked by any single traumatic event, but by the complete absence of anyone who noticed, named, and responded to what was happening. Ted Bundy fell through every crack. The school saw a quiet, intelligent boy. The community saw a charming young man. The political campaigns he worked for saw a promising volunteer. Nobody saw what was building underneath. This is the question the behavioral vault will keep returning to. Not just what these people did, but what was already in motion long before anyone was paying attention. If this kind of psychological analysis is what you came here for, subscribe. Every episode, we go deeper. And in the comments, I want to know, do you think Ted Bundy's outcome was inevitable? Or was there a moment where a different choice by him or by someone around him could have changed everything? The debate is open.